Most men don't realize they've lost their marriage until the paperwork is signed. I realized it when my wife laughed in the courtroom. The sound carried across the polished oak walls like a champagne glass shattering at a country club dinner. Sharp, elegant, cruel. Rebecca Walker sat across from me in a cream-colored designer suit that probably cost more than my first pickup truck. Her diamond bracelet caught the overhead lights every time she moved her hand across the divorce papers. Calm, confident, victorious. She didn't look heartbroken. She looked relieved, like someone finally escaping a burden she'd been embarrassed to carry. Around us, the courtroom hummed with quiet whispers and shifting chairs. Expensive perfume mixed with old paper and coffee that had been sitting too long on a burner somewhere down the hall. Divorce court in Dallas always felt strange to me. Too clean for something that ugly. Rebecca picked up her pen, signed another page, then leaned back in her chair with the kind of smile people wear when they think life just rewarded them for being smarter than everyone else. Well, she said loud enough for half the room to hear. I guess this is what happens when ambition marries comfort. A few soft chuckles slipped through the courtroom. Not many. Just enough. Enough to let me know people were watching, judging, building stories in their heads. I didn't react. I just sat there in my navy suit that Rebecca used to complain made me look like a middle manager at a hardware store. My watch was old. My boots were polished, but worn at the heel. No Rolex. No flashy cufflinks. No Italian leather briefcase. That was always Rebecca's problem with me. I never looked rich enough for the rooms she wanted to stand in. Judge Harold Bennett adjusted his glasses while flipping through the financial disclosures on his desk. Late 60s. Silver hair. Slow hands. The kind of man who looked like he trusted paperwork more than people. Rebecca's attorney, Melissa Grant, sat beside her with a satisfied expression already forming on her face. They thought this was done. Clean. Simple. A quiet execution dressed up as legal procedure. Rebecca crossed one leg over the other and glanced toward me again. You know, she said softly, almost amused. You could have made this easier years ago if you just admitted you were never built for the life I wanted. There it was. Not anger. Not sadness. Disappointment. Somehow that always cuts deeper. I looked at her for a second, really looked at her, and realized something strange. She genuinely believed I'd failed her. Not because I cheated. Not because I hurt her. But because I never turned my life into a performance she could show off at charity galas and rooftop dinners. Somewhere along the way, silence started looking like weakness to her. Judge Bennett stopped turning pages. The room shifted slightly. Papers settled. Chairs creaked. Even Melissa leaned forward a little. The judge frowned down at one particular document longer than the others. His eyes narrowed behind the glasses. Then he looked up directly at me. Mr. Walker, he said slowly, tapping the financial disclosure with one finger. These numbers cannot possibly be correct. Rebecca let out a small laugh beside her attorney and shook her head immediately. Exactly, Your Honor, she said with a smirk. My husband barely makes six figures. I folded my hands calmly on the table and met the judge's eyes. No, sir, I said quietly. They're correct. And just like that, the entire courtroom went silent. Silence does strange things inside a courtroom. One second it feels routine, almost boring, and the next it feels heavy enough to crush every person inside it. Judge Bennett stared down at the financial disclosure like the paper itself had offended him. His fingers stopped moving. Even the fluorescent lights above us seemed louder suddenly. Rebecca shifted beside her attorney, still smiling, still convinced this was some kind of accounting mistake that would embarrass me one final time before the marriage officially died. Melissa Grant leaned toward the judge with polished confidence. Your Honor, she said carefully, I believe there may be an issue with the reporting structure. My client's husband operates a small consulting business. There is no reasonable scenario where these numbers are accurate. Judge Bennett did not answer immediately. He kept scanning line after line, his expression tightening more with every page. Then he removed his glasses slowly and looked directly at me again. Mr. Walker, he said, according to this disclosure, your holdings include private infrastructure equity, energy transport partnerships, land trusts across 3 states, and controlling interests in multiple aviation leasing groups. Rebecca laughed softly beside me and shook her head like she was listening to a child make up stories at dinner. This is ridiculous, she muttered. Ethan drives a 7-year-old Ford truck. I kept my hands folded calmly on the table. That truck still works, I said. Her smile faded just a little at the edges. Tiny crack, barely visible, but I saw it. Melissa cleared her throat and opened her tablet quickly. I could hear the tapping of nervous fingers against glass. The confidence she walked in with was beginning to slip under the courtroom lights. Your Honor, she said again, more cautious this time. We formally request verification of all submitted assets. Judge Bennett nodded once without taking his eyes off the paperwork. Already done. The room shifted again. One man in the back stopped whispering mid-sentence. Someone dropped a pen near the clerk's desk, and the sound snapped through the silence like a branch breaking in winter. Rebecca looked at me fully now for the first time that morning. Not annoyed, not smug, confused. What is this? She asked quietly. I looked at her for a long second before answering. Paperwork, I said. Her jaw tightened. For 15 years, Rebecca believed she understood me because she understood the version of me I allowed the world to see. The quiet husband, the practical clothes, the old truck, the ranch outside Fort Worth with faded fencing and a porch swing older than our marriage. She thought simplicity meant limitation. Most people do. That was the funny thing about wealth. Real wealth rarely introduces itself loudly. It does not need to. Judge Bennett turned another page and exhaled slowly through his nose. Net worth estimate, he read carefully. $487 million. Nobody moved. Rebecca blinked once like her brain simply refused to process the number. Melissa's posture changed completely now. No more relaxed shoulders. No more polished courtroom smile. Just calculation. Fast calculation. Rebecca looked back at me, waiting for me to deny it, to laugh, to explain the misunderstanding away. Instead, I reached into my briefcase and slid another folder across the table toward the judge. Dark blue leather. Clean edges. Heavy enough to make a sound when it landed. Judge Bennett opened it carefully. His eyebrows lifted almost immediately. Good Lord, he murmured under his breath. Rebecca's voice came out smaller now. Ethan, what is in that folder? I looked at her calmly while the courtroom air turned cold around us. The part, I said quietly, you never asked about. Rebecca stared at me like she was trying to match two different people together in her head. The man sitting across from her in that Dallas courtroom did not fit the version she had spent years talking about at wine dinners and charity auctions. To her friends, I was always Ethan the quiet one. Ethan the ranch guy. Ethan who wore the same boots for 5 years and thought a good weekend meant grilling steaks outside instead of flying to Aspen for social media pictures. Somewhere behind her eyes, I could actually see the confusion spreading. Not because I had lied to her, but because she suddenly realized how little she ever paid attention to the things that mattered. Judge Bennett continued reading through the second folder, while Melissa Grant typed furiously into her tablet, calling assistants, checking databases, verifying ownership structures she clearly had not expected to find. Every few seconds her expression shifted tighter, more careful, like someone slowly realizing they walked into the wrong game entirely. Rebecca leaned toward me, lowering her voice now that the room no longer felt friendly to her. How long? She asked quietly. How long have you had all of this? I looked down at the table for a moment before answering. Funny thing about money. People think it changes your life overnight. Most of the time it just reveals who was already there underneath. Long. Before we met, I said calmly. Her face lost color. 15 years earlier, Rebecca met me at a fundraiser in Fort Worth before she became obsessed with luxury brands and rooftop parties in downtown Dallas. Back then she laughed easily. Back then she liked the fact that I owned land outside the city and knew how to fix things with my hands. She used to sit beside me on the porch at sunset with bare feet tucked under her legs, while summer wind rolled through the fields behind the ranch. We ate barbecue from paper plates and listened to country radio drifting from an old speaker near the barn. Those nights felt honest, real, but success changes people differently depending on what they worship. I built quietly. Rebecca performed loudly. My grandfather started Walker Transport in the late 1960s with 2 trucks and a fuel contract nobody else wanted. My father expanded it into pipelines, freight corridors, and industrial storage yards across Texas and Oklahoma. When he died, I inherited more responsibility than I inherited money. That is the part people never understand. Wealth is heavy when it is old. It comes with lawyers, contracts, expectations, and entire rooms full of people waiting to see whether you are smart enough not to destroy what previous generations built. So I stayed quiet. I kept the old truck because I liked it. I wore simple clothes because they were comfortable. I lived at the ranch because silence helped me think. Rebecca mistook all of that for lack of ambition. Across the courtroom, Melissa suddenly stopped typing. Her hand froze above the screen. Judge Bennett looked over his glasses again. "Mr. Walker," he said carefully, "these trusts date back nearly 20 years. Rebecca turned toward me slowly. 20 years, she repeated. I nodded once. My family built most of it before I ever proposed to you. The courtroom air felt different now. Earlier they looked at me with amusement. Now they looked at me the way people look at a locked vault after somebody whispers what might be inside it. Rebecca swallowed hard and glanced toward Melissa for reassurance, but her attorney no longer looked confident. She looked worried, very worried. Then Judge Bennett opened the final document inside the folder, and for the first time since this hearing started, even he looked stunned. The final document was only 3 pages thick, but the second Judge Bennett opened it, the entire energy of the courtroom changed again. His eyes moved slower now. Careful, deliberate. The kind of slow reading people do when they realize every sentence matters. Melissa Grant stood from her chair without even noticing she had done it. "Your Honor," she said cautiously, "may I review that exhibit?" Judge Bennett handed it over without a word. Rebecca watched her attorney scan the pages, and for the first time since the hearing began, fear started creeping into her expression. Small at first, just around the eyes. But fear grows fast when confidence loses oxygen. Melissa flipped another page, then another. Her lips pressed into a thin line. "This changes things," she said quietly. Rebecca frowned immediately. "What changes?" Melissa looked toward her client carefully, like someone trying to explain bad weather to a person already standing in the storm. "Most of the holdings are protected under premarital family trusts," she said. "And several entities are structured under inherited ownership groups that were never combined into marital assets." Rebecca stared at her blankly. "What does that mean?" Nobody answered immediately. The silence said enough. Outside the courthouse windows, gray clouds drifted across the Dallas skyline, muting the sunlight until the whole room looked colder. I sat quietly while Rebecca tried to process words she had never bothered learning during our marriage. Trusts, holdings, equity shielding, legacy structures. Those things bored her when we were together. She used to tune out whenever I talked business at dinner. "Can we not do work talk tonight?" she would sigh while scrolling through social media pictures from people she wanted to impress. At first, I thought it was harmless. Everybody wants different things. But over time, I noticed something else. Rebecca did not just want comfort. She wanted visibility. She wanted the kind of life strangers envy instantly. The shift started slowly after she joined a luxury real estate firm in Dallas. New friends, new restaurants, new conversations built entirely around appearances. Men who leased cars they could not afford. Women who measured success by who noticed them walking into a rooftop bar. Rebecca adapted fast to that world. Faster than I did. I remember one dinner party in Highland Park about 3 years before the divorce. A man named Trevor asked what I did for a living while sipping 18-year bourbon like he was auditioning for a commercial. "Transportation logistics," I answered simply. He nodded politely, already bored. Rebecca laughed softly beside him and said, "Ethan likes to keep things small and simple." The table chuckled. I smiled politely and let it pass. What none of them knew was that Walker Infrastructure had just closed a $200 million freight expansion contract that same week. Rebecca never asked about it. She only asked why I refused to buy a Bentley like Trevor's. Somewhere along the line, she stopped seeing restraint as strength. To her, if wealth was real, it had to be loud. Judge Bennett cleared his throat gently, pulling everyone back into the present. "Mrs. Walker," he said carefully, "based on the documentation before this court, the majority of Mr. Walker's estate cannot legally be divided as marital property." Rebecca blinked hard. "No," she said immediately. "That is impossible." Melissa did not look at her. "It is not impossible," she said quietly. "It is airtight." The words landed harder than anything else said that morning. Airtight. Rebecca turned toward me slowly like she no longer recognized the man sitting across from her. I met her eyes calmly while the courtroom stayed completely silent. Then she whispered the question that finally revealed what truly terrified her. "You knew this would happen, did you not?" I held her gaze for a moment before answering. "I knew the difference," I said softly, "between someone loving peace and someone loving status. Rebecca leaned back slowly in her chair like the strength had drained out of her spine 1 inch at a time. Just an hour earlier, she walked into that courtroom glowing with certainty. Now she looked trapped inside a reality she did not recognize. Melissa Grant gathered the documents carefully, but the confidence in her movements was gone. Every page now felt dangerous. Judge Bennett reviewed the trust structures again, while the courtroom clerk whispered quietly to another staff member near the side wall. Nobody was laughing anymore. The air had changed too much for that. Rebecca stared at me with narrowed eyes, searching for anger, arrogance, revenge, something she could understand. But I was just tired. That seemed to confuse her more than anything. "Why would you hide all this?" she asked finally. "Why pretend to be normal?" The question almost made me smile. Pretend to be normal. That was the difference between us in the end. Rebecca thought normal people were unfinished people. She thought simplicity was something you escaped once you had enough money not to live that way anymore. But I grew up around men worth hundreds of millions of dollars who still drove dusty trucks and ate breakfast at roadside diners before sunrise. Real wealth does not always shine. Sometimes it sits quietly at a wooden kitchen table drinking black coffee at 5 in the morning. My father used to say something when I was younger. If somebody needs to see your money to respect you, they were never worth impressing. Rebecca never understood that sentence. Maybe because the world she wanted to belong to operated differently. I remember the first time she became embarrassed by me in public. It was at a Christmas fundraiser downtown about 6 years into the marriage. She spent 2 hours getting ready while I waited downstairs in pressed jeans and a navy sport coat. When she came down the staircase, she stopped halfway and frowned at me. "You are wearing that?" she asked. I looked down at myself. "It is a fundraiser, not the Oscars." She sighed like I had personally disappointed her in front of invisible judges. During the event, she introduced me 3 different times without mentioning my last name. That part stayed with me longer than it should have. Not because it hurt my pride, because it told me she understood exactly what the Walker name meant in Texas business circles, and she intentionally hid it whenever it did not fit the image she wanted to curate. Looking back now, I think that was the first night I realized Rebecca loved access more than intimacy. Judge Bennett closed the final folder and folded his hands together carefully. "Based on the evidence before this court," he said, "the division of assets will proceed under the protected trust agreements and premarital structures already established." Melissa nodded once. "Professional. Controlled." Rebecca looked horrified. "So what exactly am I getting?" she asked sharply. Melissa hesitated before answering. That hesitation said everything. "The marital residence equity split," she said quietly. "A limited settlement allocation. And the vehicle agreement already outlined." Rebecca blinked rapidly. "That is impossible," she whispered. "We were married 15 years. Judge Bennett looked at her kindly, but not sympathetically. "Marriage alone does not override legal ownership structures, Mrs. Walker." The room fell silent again. Outside, rain finally started tapping softly against the courthouse windows. Rebecca stared at the table now instead of at me. Her reflection shimmered faintly across the polished wood surface. Smaller somehow, less certain. Then she laughed once under her breath, but there was nothing amused left in it. "All those years," she said quietly, almost to herself. "All those years and I never knew who I was married to." I looked at her calmly, while thunder rolled somewhere far across the Dallas sky. "No," I said softly. "You just stop trying to know." Rain streaked slowly across the courthouse windows while Judge Bennett finalized the settlement structure in a voice so calm it almost sounded cruel. Not because he enjoyed what was happening, but because truth does not need emotion to hurt. Rebecca sat motionless beside her attorney, staring at the stack of documents like they had personally betrayed her. 30 minutes earlier, she thought she was walking away from a disappointing marriage with a comfortable payout and a clean victory story to tell her friends over expensive cocktails. Now the entire narrative had collapsed in front of strangers. That is the dangerous thing about assumptions. Once they crack, everything built on top of them caves in fast. Melissa Grant adjusted her glasses and spoke carefully. "Your Honor, for clarification, Mrs. Walker had no operational authority, ownership transfer rights, or equity conversion access within the protected entities." Judge Bennett nodded once. "Correct." The word landed hard in the room. Rebecca looked between them like she was listening to another language. "No," she said quietly. "There has to be something else." Her voice sounded smaller now, softer, Like somebody slowly waking from a dream they no longer wanted to leave. I watched her carefully across the table and realized something strange. For the first time in years, Rebecca looked honest. No performance. No polished confidence. Just confusion and regret colliding together under fluorescent lights. The courtroom clerk organized paperwork while rain continued tapping against the glass in uneven rhythms. Somewhere down the hallway a phone rang briefly before fading again. Ordinary sounds. But inside that room, nothing felt ordinary anymore. Rebecca rubbed her hands together slowly and looked at me again. "You really lived like that on purpose?" she asked. "The truck, the ranch, the old clothes, all of it." I nodded once. "That was my real life." She shook her head faintly, almost laughing at herself now. "I thought you lacked ambition." I leaned back in my chair and glanced toward the rain outside. "No," I said quietly. "I just never confused attention with success." Those words hung between us longer than I expected. Rebecca looked down immediately afterward because deep down she knew they were true. I remembered all the little moments that brought us here. The parties where she stopped introducing me proudly. The dinners where she compared me to louder men with shinier watches. The vacation arguments about private jets and beach houses she wanted posted online before we even unpacked our luggage. None of those fights were really about money. They were about visibility. Rebecca wanted a husband people envied instantly. What she never understood was that the wealthiest man in a room is usually the one talking the least. Judge Bennett signed the final page and slid the documents forward. "The court considers this matter substantially resolved," he said. "Remaining procedural details will be finalized through counsel." Rebecca stared at the papers without touching them. Her diamond bracelet trembled slightly against the table when her hand moved. Tiny movement, but impossible not to notice. Melissa leaned toward her carefully and whispered something too quiet for me to hear. Rebecca swallowed hard afterward. Then she looked at me one last time with an expression I had not seen from her in years. Vulnerability. Real vulnerability. "Why did you never tell me?" she asked softly. The question almost sounded painful. I thought about answering quickly, but some questions deserve honesty instead of speed. "Because," I said calmly, "I wanted someone who could love me before they measured me." Rebecca's eyes lowered immediately. Not dramatic, not theatrical, just quiet defeat settling into a person all at once. Then Judge Bennett closed the final folder, stood from the bench, and said the one sentence that truly ended our marriage. "Mrs. Walker," he said carefully, "you did not lose access to money today. You lost access to a man you never fully understood." Nobody spoke for several seconds after Judge Bennett's words settled into the room. Even the rain outside seemed quieter somehow, softer against the courthouse glass like the storm itself was listening. Rebecca stared at the table in front of her while her attorney organized the final paperwork with careful, professional movements. But professionalism could not hide the atmosphere anymore. The hearing was over in every way that mattered. The only thing left was reality catching up to pride. I stood slowly from my chair and buttoned my jacket while court staff moved around us collecting documents. The old wooden benches creaked as a few spectators whispered quietly to one another near the back of the room. Earlier they looked at me with mild amusement. Now they kept glancing in my direction the way people look at a man whose story suddenly became much larger than they expected. Rebecca remained seated. That part stayed with me. She used to carry herself like she was already halfway out the door of every room, always chasing the next thing, the next invitation, the next status symbol that might make her feel important for a few hours. But now she sat completely still, heavy, like the weight of 15 years finally landed all at once. Melissa touched her arm gently. "Rebecca," she whispered, "we should go over the remaining settlement details privately." Rebecca nodded faintly, but did not move. Her eyes followed me instead as I gathered my briefcase from the table. "Ethan," she said quietly. I stopped. Her voice sounded unfamiliar now. Not sharp, not polished, just tired. "Did you ever love me?" The question hung there between us and the cold courthouse air. Strange thing to ask at the end of a marriage. Stranger still because I knew she genuinely needed the answer. I looked at her for a moment and remembered the girl from 15 years earlier sitting barefoot on the porch railing at the ranch while fireflies blinked over the Texas fields. Before luxury dinners. Before social climbing. Before she started measuring life through other people's eyes. "Yes," I said honestly. "I did." Rebecca swallowed hard, and looked down immediately. Then why does it feel like I never really knew you? I adjusted the handle of my briefcase slowly before answering. Because somewhere along the way, I said calmly, you stopped looking at me and started looking at what other people thought of me. Her eyes closed for half a second after that. Tiny movement, but enough. Some truths do not need volume to hurt. Judge Bennett stepped down from the bench while clerks continued filing papers behind him. He paused near our table briefly before speaking. Mr. Walker, he said respectfully, your family's legal structures are among the most thorough I have seen in 30 years. I nodded once. My father believed preparation was a form of respect. The judge gave a faint smile at that. Rebecca looked between us quietly, and I could almost see another realization forming behind her eyes. Even now, in the middle of her humiliation, people still respected me more for being calm than they ever would for being loud. That was the part she never understood. Power does not always announce itself. Sometimes it just walks slowly and speaks softly because it has nothing left to prove. I turned toward the courthouse exit while thunder rolled faintly outside over downtown Dallas. Before I reached the doors, Rebecca spoke again. If I had known, she whispered. I stopped without turning around. The marble floors reflected pale gray light beneath my shoes while rain streaked down the tall windows beside the entrance. For a second, I thought about all the ways that sentence could end. If I had known you were wealthy. If I had known you owned all of this. If I had known what I was walking away from. But none of those were the right ending. That is the problem, I said quietly. You should not have needed to know. Then I walked out into the rain while the silence behind me felt heavier than the storm waiting outside. The rain outside hit the courthouse steps in steady silver lines while I walked through the lobby, carrying the same leather briefcase I had owned for nearly a decade. No security escort. No dramatic exit. Just polished marble floors, muted conversations, and the quiet echo of dress, shoes against stone. Funny how people expect powerful moments to feel loud. Most of the important moments in my life happened quietly. My father handing me the keys to the ranch at 27. Signing the final acquisition papers for our Oklahoma freight corridor. Watching Rebecca slowly fall in love with appearances instead of people. Quiet moments change everything because they do not ask permission first. The courthouse doors opened and cold Texas air rolled against my face. A black Rolls-Royce waited near the curb beneath the gray afternoon sky. Not because I needed it to impress anyone. Mostly because my assistant insisted after years of arguing that showing up to corporate negotiations in an old Ford truck confused investors. The driver stepped forward immediately with an umbrella, but I waved him off and stood in the rain for a second instead. The city smelled like wet concrete and traffic. Familiar. Honest somehow. Behind me, the courthouse doors opened again. I did not have to turn around to know it was Rebecca. Some people carry a presence you recognize before they speak. Ethan. Her voice sounded fragile now. I looked back slowly. She stood beneath the courthouse awning holding her coat tightly around herself, while rain blurred the city lights behind her. The expensive confidence she walked into court wearing that morning was gone completely. No sharp posture. No polished smile. Just exhaustion and regret settling into a person all at once. Melissa Grant stood several feet behind her speaking quietly into a phone, already moving on to the next client, the next case, the next disaster money could not fully fix. Rebecca stepped closer toward me carefully. Was any of it real? She asked. Our marriage, the ranch, the life we had. Rain tapped softly against the roof of the car beside me, while downtown traffic hummed somewhere farther down the street. I looked at her for a long moment because despite everything, part of me still remembered the woman she used to be before status became her religion. It was real to me, I answered honestly. Her eyes watered immediately after that, but she blinked the emotion away before it could fully fall. Rebecca always hated looking vulnerable in public. I thought you were holding us back, she admitted quietly. Everyone around me kept moving higher and higher. Bigger houses, better cars, private clubs. I kept looking at our life and wondering why you never wanted more. I almost smiled at that. Not because it was funny, because it was tragic. Rebecca, I said softly, you were standing inside more than most people could dream of. You just could not see it because it did not look flashy enough. She lowered her eyes. The rain reflected across the courthouse glass behind her like broken silver lines. Trevor used to tell me you lacked drive, she whispered. My friend said I married down. There it was. Finally, not greed exactly. Influence. That slow poison people drink when they care too much about how strangers measure success. I nodded once. And did any of those people stay beside you today? She looked back toward the courthouse entrance instinctively. Nobody stood there anymore except a security guard near the metal detectors. The realization crossed her face slowly and painfully. All the people she spent years trying to impress had disappeared the second the room stopped admiring her. I reached for the car door handle while the rain soaked lightly into my jacket shoulders. Rebecca looked at me one last time. I made the biggest mistake of my life, did I not? She asked quietly. I paused for a second before answering because honesty matters more when someone finally deserves it. No, I said calmly. Your biggest mistake was believing wealth only counts when other people can see it. Then I stepped into the car while Rebecca stood alone beneath the courthouse lights watching the door close between us. The city lights stretched across the rain-covered streets of Dallas while the Rolls-Royce moved silently through downtown traffic. Water rolled down the windows in soft, distorted lines, turning neon signs and brake lights into blurred colors drifting across the glass. My phone buzzed twice beside me with messages from board members asking whether the hearing was finished. Another message came from our aviation group in Houston about a contract review scheduled for Monday morning. Normal business. Quiet business. The kind that keeps moving whether your personal life survives or not. I muted the phone and leaned back into the leather seat while thunder faded somewhere beyond the skyline. Strange thing about endings. People imagine fireworks, collapse, emotional speeches. But most endings happen in silence after somebody finally sees the truth clearly enough that pretending becomes impossible. 15 years of marriage ended not because of betrayal or screaming fights, but because one person stopped valuing what could not be displayed publicly. Rebecca wanted a life people envied instantly. I wanted a life that felt peaceful when nobody was watching. Somewhere along the road, those became two completely different destinations. The driver glanced at me through the mirror. Home, sir, he asked. I looked out at the rain sliding across the city for a moment before answering. No, I said calmly. Take me to the ranch. The highway outside Dallas opened, wide beneath the storm clouds while the city slowly disappeared behind us. Concrete became open land. Office towers